to update those of you that want to know where I've been going with my Firehawk implementation, which is an open source framework for people to utilize cloud resources for visual effects. I've been working on implementing Vault, and it's been a long, long line of what is known in DevOps as yak shaving, which is essentially the end of a long list of things that you have to do to get the original goal working. And so for the last few months, by starting to get Vault implemented, I I had a long line of tests that have resulted in a lot of testing and diving into a lot of areas that I didn't think I'd have to dive into so soon. So to give you an example, I got Vault working, and then I wanted to see if I could build an image with Deadline. And so I wanted to see if I could generate the certificates with Vault with Deadline. And then I realized when I got my image working with Deadline, in order to test Deadline, I needed really my license server connected. So in order to get my license server connected, with Houdini, I had to then get a VPN sorted to connect me to the site. So to get a VPN sorted, I then had to build a VPN image. And then in order to get the VPN working, I had to figure out a way to securely get certificates from the VPN to to the client. And I figured, well, I'm using Vault anyway. I need to actually start to pipeline that eventually anyway. So I then started looking at how I was going to do that. And I wasn't going to use the old method that I had been until now with SSH. The common way people use SSH is you have a private key and a public key, but I knew that that wasn't really going to scale. So I had to start using certificates. And Vault gave me certificates, but I had to learn how to use them and how to implement them. And that's been quite hard, quite a long process in configuring Vault to get to use them and figuring out how to actually get them to work. So the whole idea with certificates is that you really have one sort of root of trust that says, look, I'm the authority, and I'm going to say that if I give certificates to these hosts, then those hosts are a-okay within our infrastructure. So that certificate is also able to be public. That doesn't have to be hidden. So think of it like a signature that no one can actually reasonably forge because it would take a huge amount of compute to be able to crack it. So basically, the hosts that are in my infrastructure are willing to allow connections from other hosts that have this signature signed by a root authority. And then we have to also, that only just takes care of the machines. So we then also have to authenticate clients like users, say myself. So we also have a similar framework there. So as an SSH client, I have a private key and I get my SSH signer in Vault to um, produce that produce that signature or the certificate for me to be able to then authenticate into the host. And so now I can get into my Bastion host, which allows me to then make a query to Vault to acquire the certificates that are required for me to be able to log into the VPN. It's crazy. Like, there's just so much that you really have to do when you're even just testing. Sometimes the first little thing requires a huge chain of other components just to get that thing working. And I was stumped on SSH certificates. I couldn't even get it to log in for a while. And I think it was from some little, it looks like a bug because all I had to do was change allowed users from star to allowed user to a specific username, and then it worked. So there's obviously some bug there that I have to go into and figure out, but I'm happy that at least I have a working baseline now. So moving on from there, I'm going to be able to go back to figuring out how to pipeline my VPN and automate my VPN. And this will this is going to be a much, much better framework for groups of people working with cloud moving forward. It means that it's going to be possible for us to sign various users' public keys and allow them to share infrastructure. Even if that means in the future, maybe that might just mean allowing a VPN for someone to use a remote desktop. type connection. That might be one usage, or maybe you actually want to, share your infrastructure with cloud infrastructure. So you might have one or two render nodes sitting at home, and you might want to scale up. So being able to automate those connections through initialization with something like SSH certificates is a much better way going forward. Before, if you just use public keys, they don't really have any. They have a lot of security flaws. I mean, a lot of the time people will see like a login to a host, and you'll get warned that this is not a known host. People just tend to ignore that rather than do what you're supposed to do, which is actually authenticate the host through some other channel and make sure that that host's public key matches. Um, People don't actually do that. The other problem with SSH public key authentication, standard public key authentication, is that they don't have any TTLs on them, so public keys tend to just live forever, or as long as a host has had an installation of an operating system on it, and that's not particularly good either. So those keys just remain authenticated forever and allowed to be used forever. And one of the benefits of using SSH certificates is I can set a time to live on any of those certificates. So you want that to be as reasonable as possible. But let's say I set a time to live to something like a month. And sometimes you might want it to be a day, but once that time period expires, if there was any data floating around that someone were to acquire, say on an old hard drive or something like that, or maybe the system was going to get repaired, then those certificates would be useless after a certain period of time. So it certainly helps to mitigate secret sprawl and having potential gaps in your infrastructure that could be utilized at a later date. So I must admit, this has been a really, really challenging learning curve for me, trying to figure out this next stage. Just getting the VPN working, I knew it was going to be hard. I've had it working before, of course, but getting it working with Vault and figuring out how it needs to be pipelined is a major, major challenge. And I know that, when I actually get to where I really want to go, which is essentially simplifying the number of parameters that someone needs to chuck into this thing to be able to use it, it's going to make things a lot easier for people to get this thing going and hopefully build a community out of it, so that if we have a shared baseline that is modular and easy to understand, it's going to be much easier for me to be able to do a tutorial where I can say, here, just spin this up, punch in these parameters and hit go, and you're off. And that's really what my end goal is. I don't want to have to teach people how to necessarily manage like a huge list of credentials and running various bash scripts. I really want to try and make that as simple for people as possible. So that's what this whole next year of code is really going to be all about. It's going to be about reducing what I've learned and essentially distilling it into a set of modules that are much cleaner, simpler, and more reliable to use, and reducing the number of inputs that someone has to put into the system in order to spin this thing up. So thanks for listening.